The following program contains graphic scenes and is not suitable for younger children. Viewer discretion is advised.
Good evening and welcome to 16 by 9, The Bigger Picture. They risk their lives for the ultimate payoff, standing on top of the world. But experienced climbers know every fight to the summit could be their last, and sometimes the mountain wins. Tonight, our Laurel Clark takes us on the journey of William Holland, an American climber who simply disappeared into thin air.
They call it slipstream, a vertical kilometer of sheer ice. In the Columbia icefield, it is an infamous, treacherous passage, a challenge for even the most skilled mountaineer.
You gotta take a harness with you. People think the reward is the summit. It's not what you perceive at the summit, on the top of the mountain. It's what you perceive on the way up and what you learn on the way up.
It was April 3rd, 1989, and 4 men with climbing in their blood were about to learn what this mountain, Mount Snowdome, had to teach. Rick Castillo was one of them, along with partners Ken, Chris, and a geologist from Maine named William Holland. Rick remembers a man with a climber's heart.
Just a cheery, go-for-it guy, you know, lots of spirit and lots of motivation and passion. You know, he had a lot of passion for life, and that's what climbers have, is a lot of passion for life.
The 4 climbers chose the legendary and dangerous slipstream as their route. William Holland and Chris Dubé took the lead, with Rick and his partner Ken Wallater following behind. It was as if, from the start, the mountain had a warning to send.
William dropped his mitt, and I tried to catch it. It flew by, and I tried to catch it, and there's nothing I could do. His mitt was gone, and he got up about 15, 20 feet, and he broke the pick on his ice tool. And, you know, it's just the things that were leading up to it was kind of weird. Losing the mitt and breaking the ice tool, and just not a good start.
That bad start got worse as the group pushed through the cold. Snowdrifts started falling from above.
It started getting worse when we were like midway up. This was all spindrift avalanching onto us.
After 9 hours of climbing, finally the peak. A flat plateau of ice emerged with big snow ridges called cornices hanging off the edge. William and Chris reached the top first, about 100 meters ahead of Rick and Ken. But as they made the last push to the top, a blinding whiteout blew in. Rick and Ken lost sight of the climbers ahead.
It was a pretty much whiteout at this situation. We couldn't see much at all. And we saw a pair of tracks leading toward the descent route. Well, we knew where the descent was. And we followed the tracks, and all of a sudden the tracks, one set of tracks veered left. And we knew that that was the abyss. That was the, you know, you don't want to go there. It's corniced, it's death.
Tracks going the wrong way towards a 760-meter drop off the edge of the mountain. Rick and Ken kept going, following the tracks that went in the right direction, hoping to catch up with both Chris and William. But when they reached the summit, a terrifying truth hit.
We saw this lone figure pacing back and forth along the glacier without a partner. And me and Ken looked at each other, and we knew right away that something happened.
William Holland had disappeared into thin air, leaving Chris alone in the whiteout.
Oh, he was just distraught. Just lost his best friend. You know, distraught, confused, scared, mixed up. He just said that William fell. He said he was there 1 minute, next he was gone. Just heard a yell, and that was it. He didn't want to go anywhere close because it was unsafe.
To stay alive, they had to get off the mountain, but Chris was in shock and unable to climb.
He didn't know if he wanted to go down or up. He was confused, so we took control and tied him into the middle of the rope, which is the safest place to be when you're crossing a glacier.
But almost right away, disaster struck for a second time. Ken fell into a massive crack between the mountain and the glacier.
I looked in, and he was probably about 30 feet down. And so I started clearing all the snow just really frantically. I didn't know if he was all right or not. And I dislocated this shoulder in the process.
Rick managed to pull Ken to safety, but now with a dislocated shoulder, he could no longer make the climb down. The three made their way to base camp. Chris and Ken set out on skis to get help, leaving Rick in the tent, injured and alone.
It was one of the longest nights of my life, I'd have to say. It was a long night.
Throughout that long night, Rick heard haunting cries for help. It was the voice of William Holland, carrying over the howling of the wind.
I heard help, screaming, because voices carry, eh? They carry in the wind. It sounded quite real to me. It sounded human to me, but there's nothing I could do for him. The wind would be like horrendous for like 20 minutes, and then all of a sudden it would just stop, and it'd be totally still and creepy. And that's when I would hear his voice screaming, help.
But after a while, the cries for help stopped.
He must have got lodged up there maybe or something, and he died throughout the night from his injuries. That's all I could think of what would happen.
Finally, sleep took Rick until he awoke just a few hours later to this. A rescue team chopper and search dogs set out to recover him and try to find William. But Rick had resigned himself to the fact his friend was gone, perishing sometime in the night.
That route's taken a lot of lives. It was an evil route, and I still believe it is an evil route. It's dangerous.
Like all climbers, Rick understood and accepted the harsh reality that death can come with any climb.
You're supposed to accept it before you leave. You got a 50% chance that you're going to die, and if you don't accept it, then you shouldn't go.
While Rick knew that reaching the summit could come at a terrible price, more than 4,000 kilometers away, nothing could have prepared William's young daughter, 5-year-old Laurel, for the heartbreaking news.
We went shopping for some dresses, and I remember picking out that night, before we went to bed, the dress that I wanted to wear to go and pick him up in at the airport.
It was late at night. Laurel's mother was putting her to bed, reading a bedtime story, when they heard a knock at the door.
I heard her open the door, and I heard sort of voices, and then I heard her say, "Oh my God," and I heard her start crying, and I crept down the stairs.
And in an instant, a little girl's life was shattered, her father taken from her, her memories of him frozen in time forever.
She turned to me and she said, "Laurel, your daddy was killed in a climbing accident." It was a moment when there was a part of my childhood that ended.
Coming up on 16 by 9.
My mom called me when I was grocery shopping and said, "They found your father, Laurel." My first thought was, that means that he's not coming back.
That's all coming up. Welcome back to 16 by 9, the bigger picture.
William Holland's deeply grieving family mourned his loss, but without finding William's body, there could be no closure. So the search continued. Here again is Laurel Clark with a shocking conclusion to this story.
William Holland disappeared into thin air while climbing Mount Snowdome on April 3, 1989. The last sign of him alive was tracks in the snow at the edge of a cliff.
We're beginning a search on Slipstream for the missing climber.
They had a clear day, 2 dogs, and a helicopter on their side. On April 9, 1989, a search crew ventured into the elements with hopes of finding William Holland, the U.S. climber who had disappeared into thin air 6 days before.
This is the area, the cornice that the climber fell off and then down, and just around the bend there's a couple fans that we'll be checking with the dog.
For 5 days, bad weather and the threat of avalanches had paralyzed the team. Most of their search of Mount Snowdome was done from the air. The ground was far too unstable. The rescuers hoped this day would be different, but the mountain had other plans.
Large slide just came off the top and down to the expand the area that we are going to be searching.
Icefalls had left behind massive fields of snow, obliterating some of the search sites and potentially putting the lives of rescuers in jeopardy.
So the decision has been made. There's just too much objective danger. Possibility of ice coming down.
It was too dangerous. The team had to pull out and end the search. Parks Canada safety expert Steve Blake knows the tale.
They just decided not to put people in the next day. In absence of a single clue, they didn't have a lead to go on other than his footsteps at the ridge crest 500 meters above.
Those footsteps, the very last sign of William alive. In the years that followed, William's mysterious disappearance intrigued climbers and haunted his young daughter. Laurel Holland grew up, moved from Maine to Washington and then to New York, never escaping the questions of what happened to her father. As the years passed, she harbored a secret hope that he would miraculously one day return.
My mom had picked me up from a friend's sleepover party, and we were driving along this road and we passed a bicyclist, and my dad was a huge bicyclist. And this guy sort of veered off onto another road, and she stopped the car and she goes, "That was your father." And we both sat there in the car for like 5 or 10 minutes. And like in silence, and we just didn't move. And then eventually she started up the car again.
As his family moved on, remarkably, so did William Holland. Deep inside a receding glacier, the climber's body traveled roughly 50 meters a year for 21 years. And then, on August 15th, 2010, this. 2 decades after William Holland fell to his death, 2 hikers came upon a crumpled heap of clothes and climbing gear. William's icy tomb had melted away, exposing the long-lost climber frozen in time. Steve Blake went up to the site to recover William's body. It was a startling scene.
I think for the 2 young fellows that came across it was a bit shocking.
Steve found the climber and his gear so intact he still had a pack and rope slung over his shoulder.
It was apparent that it had been there for a long time just from the equipment. And I was quite surprised that it was still a person. It was still, we removed the body of a person after that long.
Using dental records, medical examiner Dr. Raymond Rivera in Edmonton was able to confirm that person was William Holland. And he was able to answer something else, how William died on that fateful day.
Based upon some of the autopsy findings, as well as information that was obtained at the time the incident occurred in 1989, it would appear that Mr. Holland died as a result of multiple blunt injuries due to a fall.
A fall of more than half a kilometer off the side of this mountain. News of the remarkable discovery quickly spread. Rick Castilla found out this summer while in Whitehorse.
It was just an eerie feeling, seeing that equipment and stuff on the rocks and part of his body. It was kind of weird. Knowing that he was totally intact, mummified or whatever you'd call it, frozen.
Frozen in ice and snow for 21 years, for William's daughter, now an adult, the discovery unearthed the deep grief of her childhood.
My mom called me when I was grocery shopping and said, "They found your father, Laurel." And the first reaction that I had was, I burst into tears right in the middle of Chelsea Market. And my first thought was, that means that he's not coming back.
Her long-held dream that her father would somehow return alive ended once and for all. But in her years of poring over her father's journals and trying to find some reason, some answer behind the loss, finding her father's body has helped her gain another perspective, a kind of closure.
That was who he was, and that was what he loved to do. And in some ways, it's really beautiful that he perished doing what he loved.
After 21 years of wondering about her father's death, Laurel Holland can now move ahead, cherishing the wonder of his life.
How beautiful in some ways that the mountains took hold of him, and he was ultimately ended up where he needed to be.